Welcome to Random Samples, where we dive into the world of science education, featuring conversations with some of our favorite scientists, educators, science teacher educators, and advocates who support the mission of the National Center for Science Education. I'm Amanda Townley, Executive Director here at NCSC. Throughout the year, we'll explore the many ways in which science is taught, learned, and championed across the country, while also celebrating the individuals who make it all possible. At NCSC, we are dedicated to ensuring that accurate science, free from ideological influences, is taught in public schools nationwide. We provide resources, training, and support to educators and advocate for the importance of sound science education in the face of challenges like misinformation, disinformation, and denialism. Each episode of Random Samples is a chance to learn from those who are shaping the future of science and science education. Today on the show, I'm thrilled to welcome Brenda Wineapple. She's an acclaimed historian, biographer, and author of several compelling books on American cultural and political life. Her latest work dives deep into one of the most iconic courtroom dramas in U.S. history, the Scopes Trial, where science, religion, and public opinion all collided in a Tennessee courtroom 100 years ago in 1925. In her recent book, Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, Brenda explores how the so-called monkey trial became a national spectacle, revealing much more than just a debate about evolution. It was about who gets to define truth in a rapidly changing America. We'll talk to her today about the real stakes of the trial, the large cultural forces that were at play, and what this moment still has to teach us nearly a century later. Hi, Brenda. Thank you so much for joining us at Random Samples.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. And so for our members who don't know, I had the pleasure of hearing you speak recently at Evolution 2025 in Athens, Georgia, in a special symposium series that surrounded scopes. And so I also want to make sure to encourage our members to read your book. So I'm not going to be giving any spoilers, but I do have to tell them it is a powerful, powerful story.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was illuminating for me to write it. And of course, it was illuminating for me in a different way to be invited to that wonderful conference, Evolution 2025. I learned so much. I was surrounded by wonderful scientists who are so committed to their work, but also to disseminating their work. And it's so important to be able to do this, as you mentioned, these days especially, but any days, really. It's very, very exciting. And one thing I came away with was wishing and hoping, and perhaps we can encourage more people to write about science, because I think it's so exciting. And I think the ideas of what happened in the past, which is what I write about, but what's going on in the present and the future is also so important to all of us, really, even us non-scientists here.
I couldn't agree with you more. And, in dealing with denialism, and I think I mentioned this as well when we were at the conference, we need that diversity of voices and we need to have that direct communication where it's not just the scientific literacy, or literature, but the narratives and the stories and the humanity behind science that people can really grab a hold of and resonate with.
Well, that's such a good point, it seems to me, because science is one thing, and it's a word that I think scares a lot of lay people. But as you just said, there are humans behind it. There are people doing it all the time. There are people in laboratories or in classrooms who are excited by it. And I think those stories, the connection between what people do and how they speak about it, is so important, and so that we understand that there are people here. This is not abstract at all, really, that all ideas and discoveries are really embodied in human beings. It's humans that had to do all of this, and it's really kind of wonderful. And I've been thrilled to learn so much about it. You mentioned the Scopes trial, sort of segue here, but there were 7 scientists who came to or went to Dayton, Tennessee to testify. They were all very religious men, by the way. They were all men. I should point that out. It was 1925, um, and um, and they were excited to be there because they wanted to share their ideas. And even though they were not allowed to testify in the trial, their testimony was written into the appeal. So lucky me, I got to read it. And being a non-scientist, to say the least, I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to be so intimidating. And it really wasn't at all. And one of the chapters I had the most fun writing in this book was the chapter where I explained their arguments in a way that I hope the general reader could understand in the same ways that I did. So, I learned a lot. I enjoyed a lot.
And that's really important. And speaking of you've written about some really major moments and figures in American history. So what was it about this particular trial that felt historically urgent or really resonated for you?
Well, it's so interesting because in the 20th century, not that long ago, but somewhat ago, there were a lot of major trials, and a lot of large issues that were themselves debated in courtrooms. Courtrooms are very interesting places. It's not surprising to me that there are so many courtroom dramas on TV because, in fact, what happens in a courtroom, it is very much like theater, where different people talk about their ideas, or what passes in some cases for ideas, and kind of thrash them out. And so the Scopes trial, I thought, this is an amazing event in American history. We do and don't know anything about it. Sometimes it's taught as just a circus, a crazy thing that was going on in a little town in Tennessee where people were selling hot dogs, to make a little local money. Um, and I thought, no, no, it has to be much more than that. 200 journalists came to Tennessee to cover this trial, and it was covered internationally. And so I thought, what is going on here? What is this about? And the more I looked into it, the more I thought, this is a very interesting moment in American history and culture. Um, and so that's how I got interested in it, really, in that particular way. And also because there were such monumental figures who had come to actually make the arguments. This was not trivial. This was not your, local, I don't know, firefighter, sort of contesting cows on the lawn. This
Mhm.
was major. So
And speaking of that, with you mentioned over 200 members of the media and how this exploded really to a national and international level. In in your evaluation, how do you decide what voices or perspectives to elevate in telling that story? And were there locals or lesser known figures than Darrow and William Jennings Bryan who added unexpected depth in that story?
absolutely. I mean, the easy thing is that these two larger than life characters, these two rock stars, William Jennings Bryan, who's very well known at the time, big leader in the Democratic Party, Clarence Darrow, famous lawyer in the 20th century, maybe famous American lawyer for all time, for all I know. I think you could probably say that. So that was easy. Those were the two kind of poles or linchpins. But there were so many other people. For one example, there were a lot of, and this was obviously before television, but there were a lot of evan- evangelists and fundamentalists who were going cross country. People like Billy Sunday, aptly named, who had been a baseball player and now was really he was an enormously popular figure. Stadiums would fill up just to hear him because he enacted kind of argument with God. We would punch God or punch the devil, and he, of course, I shouldn't say of course, but he hated evolution. One of the things that he took to task was evolution. So he's wonderful characters, really. And as I say, we forget. what was going on in the culture at this time. That's one aspect. Then you have a lot of the liberal clergy, like Harry Fosdick in New York City, who started, it's kind of an ecumenical church, who pushed against the idea that you have to separate religion and science. There's no reason why. That's a misunderstanding of science, and it's a misunderstanding of religion, both. So he was very adamant, and there were people like Fosdick who were very, very powerful in the church, in the Protestant clergy, who were saying, what's the problem here? So those are the two. You have the Protestant liberal clergyman, you have a Billy Sunday, evangelical, uh, superstar, really. You have Amy Semple McPherson, we shouldn't leave the women out, who was out in California with theatrics. You know, she would bring horses and whatever and dress up on stage. She too was against evolution, but these people didn't understand evolution. And then you have in the trial, working with somebody like Darrow, you have a man who's practicing Catholic, you have a man who's not practicing his Jewish religion but identified very strongly as Jewish, and then you have a Southerner whose grandfather, I think it was, maybe, yeah, it had to be grandfather, was a Confederate general.
Yes.
So can you imagine? You know, that's America.
Yes.
Really,
quite
right?
the cast of characters, absolutely.
Quite a cast of characters, yeah.
And you bring up a good point that we often hear scopes framed as just being science versus religion. But in your research, did that binary hold up, or was the reality more complicated?
You know, it's interesting when you ask that, because you know, I think there's nothing in American history or culture. I don't know about science. You tell me about that. That's binary. There's really not. Binaries don't work because it's either or. It's black or white. You know, and there's so much middle ground. There are so many things that are on a spectrum. So there was the aspect, as I mentioned, of science versus religion or faith versus religion, but it's not in a vacuum. And you have to think, this is happening in a period of time, the 1920s. It's important to look at what else is going on, just the way you would today. If this is happening in the legislature, in the Senate, or in, you know, your local grocery store, why? What is the larger context in that sense? And so I was very interested in, because I'm interested in American culture and literature, what else is happening? Because the people, we forget because we're living now. But 100 years ago, the people were just like us, and they got up in the morning and they read the newspaper, or they turned on the radio, because radio was pretty new and a lot of people had radio. And so they're part of something that we don't see if we just think in terms of areas. So there was just, people were nervous. People are, I guess, always nervous, but there were specific things to be anxious about in 1925. You had just, for one example, you had just fought a gruesome, horrible world war. You know, we've almost become sort of immune to that, but nothing like that had ever happened before. And there were all these veterans coming back looking for jobs, or who were suffering from shell shock. And there were so many weapons of destruction that were associated, unfortunately, with science. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, because people were confusing science and technology, and at the same time you have what I would call, and I think you and your listeners would call, junk science, which was eugenics. It was very popular, very important. A lot of progressives who were into eugenics. Right. Margaret Sanger, who developed and promoted birth control pills, was a eugenicist. Mm-hmm. They thought they were doing good. You know, they thought we were going to create a master race. Well, help us. God, you know, heaven help us. But that's what was going on. It was very powerful at this time. And the Ku Klux Klan, imagine that. Imagine that almost 25 to 50,000 Klans people went to Washington to march. it's almost terrifying. And you can see pictures of it, actually. I think I showed you, Amanda, some pictures last week of it.
You did, and it was mind-blowing. We can't even think of something like that to that extent and in that frame of the picture happening.
Right.
It really shocks your senses to even think about it.
Yeah, so that was the Klan. They didn't like Catholics. They didn't like Jews. They didn't like immigrants. Immigrants were largely Catholics and Jews, so that worked out. They didn't like blacks, and they didn't like other, religions. But I mean, it was amazing. And in some sense, that was being fought out by proxy, not directly, but in a proxy way during the trial too. So it's important to look at all of these things, because sometimes, as we all know, when we're dealing with each other, for example, sometimes what we see on the surface is not everything that's going on. There's a subtext.
Absolutely.
There's always, I shouldn't say, but there's often a subtext. People say something, they mean something else. So in that sense, there were a number of subtexts in that trial.
And it's fascinating and terrifying that here we are, almost, we're right at a century later to the month, and we're still wrestling with similar questions. So evolution in schools, science denialism, even book bans. So do you see echoes of scopes in today's cultural debates?
I wish I could say no. I wish I could say it was irrelevant and we could put it over there and forget about it. But I think that, as you yourself just said, we have censorship, we have denialism, we have junk science, we have, questions of education, who controls education. We have issues about whether a Bible should be in the classroom. What do you do then what about the Quran, for example? We have all of this. We have libraries being told, and librarians, to take books off the shelves. The U.S. Naval Academy, bizarrely, to my mind, got rid of books by Toni Morrison, but kept Hitler's Mein Kampf. You have in science, I read about, I think in the Washington Post, you had a couple of scientists who were afraid to publish a paper because even though they were American citizens, they were afraid it would lead to their deportation, or persecution. This is remarkable to me at this particular time, and it seems we're again in a period where a lot of these issues are coalescing around vaccines, for example, and the scientific research there, or money going into scientific research. So I see this in a various ways, and I think that it's important to understand our history, so that on one hand we don't feel that we're unique, because we're not, but on the other hand to kind of say, well, what were the ways and the strategies of pushing back against this? And I mentioned earlier, and certainly in your wonderful introduction, that your whole center pushes against this. I want people to write about this in ways people could understand. So do you. So I think it's a way to stay vigilant and to say, look, we're not alone. We've had this fight before. It's not over. That would be nice, but that's not what's happening. Right. So we can be vigilant, and we can see that there are ways of responding, whether it's through the Constitution and the courts, or whether it's through writing, or whether it's through centers like yours, or in the classroom. So I think that's really very important. I do. I'm a great believer in that. And as I have to say, and as one Dayton resident said when everybody came to Tennessee to hear the trial, he said, we're going to get a college education for nothing. So we're always educating and re-educating, because, different generations. So.
I love that. And as an educator, in terms of your writing and sharing these stories and finding these pieces that so often do get kind of lost in the years, it seems like. What is it that you hope that readers of your book or even listeners to our cast today take away from not only your writing, but this moment in history?
Well, as I said, certainly I hope people listen and also read the book. And I think that what they'll find is, we go back to something we were talking about before, that there are no binaries. And so that sometimes the people who are taking positions that seem absolutely offensive to us, they're also real people. And it's important to understand where they're coming from. We don't have to endorse it.
Right.
We don't have to like it. We don't have to suffer it. But it's important to understand that they are themselves part of a historical, cultural, political, perhaps even scientific context. And they are believing something. And so the question would be, how do we then ourselves respond to these beliefs that way? And in that sense, I think there's a way in which, if we do that with empathy, that's one of the things I try to create, is that there are arrays, as you said, there are a lot of characters in this book. It's not just abstract. These are people acting out certain things. I want you to care about them. I want you to empathize, so that we can then take away that kind of capacity in our personal lives. That's what I try to do. I mean, of course, I have points of view, be naive enough, but it doesn't mean I'm not interested in motive.
Yes. And in alignment with that, the term that I always use is radical empathy, is the ability to pause and listen and understand and seek to understand, because that's the key to unlocking that dialogue and opening that space and breaking through those walls. So thank you for that. That's critical.
No, thank you. I mean, and I think you see that, whether you read or you are a scientist or an educator in that particular way, that you just open up to different kinds of points of view. And for me, it's always illuminating, really, because nothing is as simple as it seems, and nothing is as dire as it seems either. I think it's important to sort of emphasize that as well. But in any event, and we can see there's a lot of humor here too. I mean, sometimes it's unbelievable. And as one person in the trial turned to another person and said, "This is the 20th century." So I would turn to you and say, "This is the 21st century." Right?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Brenda, I cannot thank you enough for being a part of the symposium and also giving some of your time today to talk about the work that you do. I want to mention your book again, Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. It is a great read. I know our Deputy Director, Glenn Branch, reviewed that book as well for our members and tremendously enjoyed it. So thank you again.
Thank you. It was wonderful to see you, Amanda. It's wonderful to be just a tiny little part of your wonderful organization.
Well, we tremendously appreciate it. And, all of us joining in the fight together, that's the thing. We can move mountains with enough people doing these things to push back.
Right. Okay. In all of our different ways. That's right. Good. Thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you. Be well.
So I'm going to thank all of our listeners for joining us today for Random Samples with Brenda Wineapple. I hope it has sparked your curiosity and inspires you to learn more about the critical work being done to ensure quality science education for all students, and that we are learning from our past to impact our future. To learn more about the National Center for Science Education and how you can get involved, just visit us at ncsc.ngo. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and share it with others who care about science and education. Remember, we're all in this together to create a future where scientific literacy and accurate science education are accessible to everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Random Samples.